everyone. Welcome to Smarter News. My name is Jenna, and I'm so glad you're here today for a really important conversation on a rapidly developing story, a war in the Middle East. And because we have so many different developments happening hour by hour, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the introduction. Here are the basics as we know it today. Hamas, a U.S. designated terrorist group, launched an attack in Israel on Israelis over the weekend. Israel responded by declaring war on Hamas and attacking Hamas, specifically in the area where Hamas operates and lives, a place called Gaza. I'm going to leave the basics there. Even in that description, depending on the media outlet you listen to or the person that's speaking about this conflict, you may get slightly different versions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that or the reason why. But when I first saw these headlines, there was one person I wanted to talk to that I wanted to make sure you at Smarter News heard from. And it's a man named Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan Schanzer is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. I've known Jonathan for years. I've interviewed him multiple times and relied on him as a reliable source of information when it comes to terrorism in many different parts of the world. But one of his areas of expertise is Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah. You're going to hear a little bit about that, Iran, and beyond. In fact, Jonathan actually literally wrote the book on the most recent conflict that happened between Israel and Hamas in 2021. Here's the title of the book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. Jonathan speaks Hebrew. He speaks Arabic. He's worked for the U.S. government at times in the U.S. Treasury, looking at terrorism financing, which is really important. Where's the money coming from? How is it being used? His doctorate was earned looking at work involving how the U.S. Congress is trying to counter terrorism. And so his whole body of work really focuses around terrorism groups, but specifically the Middle East and specifically Hamas and Israel. So I reached out to him. He's extremely busy. We got just a couple minutes together, and I hope he provides you, as he did provide me, some really interesting things to think about. Not all of it is easy to hear, and that might be a good just heads up. You know, oftentimes I have the radio or podcasts playing in the background. Some of what we discuss probably isn't for young ears. Totally up to you, of course, but just, words to the wise. We are talking about very difficult, sometimes graphic details of what has transpired. And I'm just grateful that he spent a little time with us. So without further ado, here's Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, thanks for coming back on Smarter News.
Pleasure, Jenna. Great to be with you.
I don't think I've ever asked you this. With all your extensive research and studies, how did you choose to focus on terrorism? You could have picked birds, Jonathan, or flowers to study. Why was it terrorism? What was it about the field of terrorism that really sparked your interest?
So it's actually an interesting question. I did study the Middle East in college, and I really loved it. I had a professor at Emory University who really got me into Middle East diplomacy. And after I worked for a couple of years out of college, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. And actually, I went to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem because I thought I wanted to be the next Dennis Ross, the next diplomat that was going to broker peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. It was really about diplomacy when I first got into it. But once I got to Israel, this was the late 1990s. And what happened is almost everywhere I went, there were Hamas terrorist attacks that were taking place. This is the height of the peace process that Hamas was trying to derail with terrorism. I had also had an experience back in 1996. I was at the Olympic bombing, and I had that experience there where actually friends of mine were hurt. I was very lucky that I wasn't. But anyway, what it sort of seemed to me was that throughout the late 1990s, it felt like terrorism was following me. And I kind of said, well, maybe it's time to follow terrorism instead. And I began to just do a lot of reading. It started with Hamas, but I moved quickly to Al-Qaeda, to Iran. And, I was in the right place. As my colleague Cliff May says, if you want to study tornadoes, go to Kansas. You want to study, you want to study terrorism, go to Israel. And I did that not knowing that that's what I was going to do, but came out with a set of skills that I guess has served me since.
Well, absolutely, because I thought to myself that there's one person to talk to about Hamas and Hezbollah and also Iran and also Israel. It's Jonathan Schanzer. So I'm really grateful for this time. And I know we have limited time at that because you're so busy. Just even the description of Hamas, I think, is important to talk about because in general, if you said to someone, anyone walking around the streets, name a terrorist group. You may get Al Qaeda, you could get ISIS, but it probably isn't Hamas for at least the American audience. And as I was looking and preparing for our interview, Jonathan, I thought it was interesting that although there are media outlets, and Spur News is one of them, will say Hamas is a terrorist group as designated by the United States. Hamas is referred to in all sorts of ways as a militant group, as a Palestinian militant group, a Palestinian Islamist movement, a terrorist organization, a resistance group. We see it described all sorts of ways. And you don't see that with other terrorist groups. You don't see that sort of even verbal confusion. So, why is that happening when we talk about Hamas? What is that about?
A couple of reasons. One, and unfortunately, we see a lot of this these days in the United States, Europe, around the world, moral relativism. People saying, well, who's to say who a good guy is and who a bad guy is? And, it's all shades of gray. We see a lot of that specifically with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where everybody seems to have an expert opinion, but most people know very little. And that's just unfortunately what we see in the United States. There is, of course, a whole sort of crew of what is referred to as progressive. I don't think I agree with that terminology, but we see people on the far left of the American spectrum embracing Hamas, saying that Israel deserves to be attacked. There are actually people that, even in light of the terrorist attack, where 1,200 people were killed and mutilated and burned and beheaded. There's still people that we see, traveling in polite company here in the United States on college campuses, embedded in our political system, that we're saying that Hamas had a right to do this. It was justified in doing this. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that Hamas is not just a terrorist organization. It's also, since 2007, it has been the governing body in the Gaza Strip. It actually conquered the Gaza Strip by force in a civil war with the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority. And ever since then, they have ruled this. It's a tiny little coastal enclave. It's about the size of Washington, D.C., Gaza Strip. There's about 2.2 million people there, but they have been the government as well as the terrorist organization that has terrorized Israel. What is interesting, just to sort of fast forward to where we are today, I was talking to some Israeli former officials about what happened and what is likely to happen. And, what they all indicated was that, Israel was willing, even with all the rocket attacks and the multiple wars that have taken place since 2007, that Israel was willing to allow Hamas to govern as long as it never directly threatened Israel's survival. And what just happened on Saturday, according to these folks that I've talked to, that they've revoked their right to exist. And so the Israelis are no longer going to allow them, this is what they say, they're not going to allow them to govern in Gaza any longer. And they're not going to allow them to exist in Gaza any longer. So I think what we're about to see is the dismantling. If the Israelis have their way, we're going to see the dismantling of a terrorist organization and the end of the Hamas government. And so when people talk about Hamas, they will probably be talking about it in the past tense.
Do you think that's accurate, that could happen?
I think that is exactly what the Israelis plan to do. It's not going to be easy. This is, again, it's a tiny, densely populated place, and it's not going to be easy to engage with the enemy. It's urban warfare, not unlike, what America went through in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not an easy battle in front of Israel, but I think Israel knows the terrain. They've been operating there for many years. I wouldn't be surprised if there were operators on the ground right now preparing the ground for the war to come. There will be, I think, a question of Hamas's external leadership. That's going to be a lot harder for Israel to destroy. You have to remember, Hamas is an international terrorist organization. They've got assets and individuals operating in Iran, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Qatar. in Malaysia, of all places, right? So it's got a presence in a lot of different jurisdictions. I would not be surprised to see the Israelis, over the course of several months or even several years, hunt down these figures the way they did after the Munich massacre of 1972. If you recall, that was a famous terrorist attack where the PLO, using the name Black September, killed almost the entire Israeli Olympic team. And what happened after that was the Mossad and a group of assassins went around hunting down those responsible. I would be surprised if Israel doesn't do that after it's done whatever it's going to do in the Gaza Strip.
I know you have a lot of sources and you talk to a lot of different people across government. So I'm taking in what you say very seriously and to heart. What makes Hamas different than other terrorist organizations?
You know, it's a good question. People seem to have a soft spot for Hamas, more so than, you know, I mean, you never really heard anybody in the United States say, well, you know, you have to understand the grievances of ISIS, and that's why they beheaded Americans. You never heard that, right? You often, I mean, maybe people asked why Al Qaeda hated us so much that they flew airplanes into the World Trade Center, but nobody said, oh, come on, you know, Al Qaeda is not really a terrorist organization. The thing about Hamas is that you know, it has identified itself as fighting for the Palestinian cause and for Muslims. It's actually a mashup of Islamist ideology and nationalist ideology. And it also is the underdog, right? This is an organization that is trying to fight on behalf of you know, an embattled, impoverished Palestinian people who would love nothing more than to build a national project and to create a homeland for themselves. And so there's something that I think appeals to people on that. The other thing is, I think with Hamas, you know, the Israelis themselves and others, up until Saturday, all viewed it as a weak organization, that because it had never really carried out an attack of this scale before, because it didn't have thousands of murders on their hands, it didn't have that kind of blood on their hands, maybe over the course of the full body of work that you see from Hamas dating back to its founding in 1988, you could say that, you know, that there was a large body count, but they never carried out any kind of mass atrocity like this. And I actually think that it's for that reason we began to see a shift. You know, if you were watching TV, CNN, I mean, MSNBC, you know, hearing administration officials, foreign government officials, they were getting choked up over what happened on Saturday. I mean, the massacre was just so brutal. Pregnant women having, you know, babies ripped from their stomachs, children getting beheaded and burned, entire families being slaughtered, kids getting pulled from their mother's arms and getting dragged into the Gaza Strip, where then videos emerged of the kids being tormented by their captors. I mean, this is really sick, depraved kind of stuff. And I think it may actually have changed the way in which the public has viewed Hamas, and that moral relativism, that fog may be lifting as a result of the clarity.
It's interesting to hear the statements coming from President Biden as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel. There's the references to Hamas and ISIS. ISIS, you know, Hamas is ISIS. And I was curious to ask you, is that intentional for the global audience to try to get the public to understand the depravity because ISIS was known as a terrorist group for that? Or is there a message, is that almost a message for Hamas themselves to compare them to an ISIS terrorist group versus some other organization? What is that reference all about in your mind?
It's a really smart question and there's a couple of layers of analysis here. And I don't know if that many people have been attuned to it, but I would expect nothing less from you. What I would say is that, first of all, the ISIS phenomenon was one that actually turned the Arab world against, you know, this sort of trend of terrorism that it had long tolerated. That ISIS was so jarring in its violence and so thoroughly disgusting and detestable in the way that it mutilated people and treated people inhumanely, right? Like garbage is the way that they treated people. And that really, I think, hit home to the point that, you had the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Jordanians. I mean, the entire Arab world was united against, as they called it, Daesh, against ISIS. And I think that framing it that way may have actually been a message to the Arab world as much as it was to the United States. And there's, I think, the second level of analysis, which is, how do you try to put into context what just happened to Israelis? How do you explain to the world what it felt like to see 1,200 of your countrymen butchered by a terrorist organization? The closest thing that we have is 9/11, which, I mean, let's face it, if you're 25 years old today, you don't remember 9/11. There's a whole generation that has no idea what that was. You and I, of course, remember it, and we talked about it a lot on the airwaves. But there's a whole new generation of people that are completely disconnected. So I think this was an attempt to connect to all manner of American citizens. And then there's, I think, one other level, which I think is also interesting as well, which is, I think there's a real temptation in Israel to draw Iran into this immediately, because Iran stands behind Hamas. Iran is the sponsor, financial sponsor. They provide the weapons and the training and the technological assistance, material assistance. I mean, they are the sort of ATM and the piggy bank of Hamas. But the American public is not quite ready to look at Iran as an enemy, right? I mean, half of the American public is still talking about making a nuclear deal with Iran, misguided as that may be. The administration has made it such that it's just, not something the Democrats are going to countenance. And I think that the Bibi speech, the Netanyahu speech, drawing the comparison to ISIS, was an attempt not, I think the Israelis understand they've got world opinion on their side. I don't know how long it lasts, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month, who knows? But you start bringing Iran into this, and it might be harder to hold half the American public, a lot of Europe. And so there is, I think, a careful dance here that we're seeing on the part of the Israelis, are tap dancing around this. The last thing I'll note on this, and again, this is many layers of analysis here, they also may not want to draw Iran in too soon to the battle that's underway. The Israelis want to take care of Hamas first, and then they may need to handle Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon. And then after that, they might need to handle Iran itself. There is a potentially large battle that could unfold here in the Middle East. It would be very ugly, very long, very painful. But what the Israelis don't want is a multi-front conflict right now. And so I think trying to keep Iran out of the discussion, at least for the moment, reflects their order of battle. And that order of battle begins with Hamas.
That's very interesting, considering some of the careful language as well by President Biden and some of his team about Iran, not being too quick, recognizing Iran as part of the puzzle, but being cautious about being more specific than that. You mentioned that world opinion, even the opinion of many different media outlets that may have slightly different editorial points of view have come into an alignment to condemn this terrorist attack in the way that they're presenting the news. And I wanted to make sure that in our conversation, we talked about those that don't agree with that opinion. One of them, in an interview, the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK, a name that you're familiar with, and perhaps you can also provide some context for our audience, had some interesting words on the BBC just a few days ago. I wanted to play it for us, and then we could talk a little bit about how this opinion is also part of the story.
Do you support what Hamas launched on Saturday morning?
Well, this is not the right question, Louis. Really, the right
it's
question.
It's an important question.
No, it is not an important question because
whether you support their action or not is an important question.
No. It is not an important question. Hamas is a group, is a militant group. You're talking with the Palestinian representative. Our position is very well known and clear.
And what is that? Do you support Hamas's actions?
And then you cannot equate. This is not about support or not support. I am here to represent my people, the Palestinian people, what they are going through. I'm not here to condemn anybody. And if anybody that needs to be condemned, it's what you call the only democracy in the Middle East, that is Israel, between parentheses, that is doing what you have just reported, targeting civilians. And this has not just happened the last 48 hours.
Hamas was just targeting Palestinians, but you won't condemn that.
I'll tell you one thing. Hamas is not the Palestinian government, okay? the Israeli government is giving orders for its organized army. So please don't draw any symmetry here. Don't equate. There is no way you can draw any symmetry. And don't equate between the occupied and the occupier. This doesn't serve justice to understand for your audience and viewers the real situation. What Israelis have seen, which we started by saying tragic, the last 48 hours, the Palestinians see every day for the last 50 years. You know the situation in Gaza, you've just described it. This is the biggest open-air prison. Those people, 2 million, have been taken hostage by Israel for the last 16 years. So I'm saying this just to say, Louise, perhaps this is about time we abandon this rhetoric, very dangerous, this framework, and we start giving people the real ugly truth sometimes.
What do you think, Jonathan? What's your reaction to that?
Well, that's his name is Husam Zomlot. He was the ambassador to the United States for the PLO mission before the Trump administration kicked the PLO out because of policies of funding the families of terrorists. And this is, I think, reflective of a broader problem. And you and I have talked about this too in the past. There is just no leadership right now, no moral leadership in the Palestinian Authority. The PLO, the Palestinian Authority, they are seen as more pragmatic. But the man that you just heard, if that's pragmatic, we have a problem, right? The guy couldn't even condemn the murder of 1,200 people, the murdering of children, of elderly. I mean, it's truly remarkable, the callousness. I understand.
But you heard what he said, Jonathan, right? That he said this is what's been happening to Palestinians. And that's the argument that we continue to see. And I know our audience is seeing on social media.
Right.
How do you navigate that?
And there is a big difference between what Israel does and what just happened on Saturday. What happened on Saturday was like a murder orgy. It's kind of the only way that I can describe it. I mean, these people streamed across the border and killed everybody and anybody that was in their way. The Israelis have a professional military that does not deliberately target civilians when they have to bomb a building because there's military infrastructure inside. In the years past, they have dropped what they call knock-knock bombs. They let the inhabitants know that they get out. They will actually send messages to cell phones through a technology that they've developed, letting people know in Arabic that an attack is coming and that they need to get out of the way. The Iron Dome missile defense system that Israel created some 10 years ago has knocked down the vast majority of the rockets that Hamas has fired blindly into Israel with regularity. I actually would argue that had Israel not developed that, then you would have seen what a true bloodbath would have looked like, because the Israelis would have had no choice but to respond to direct strikes on their civilian population. Instead, what's actually happened, and this I think is really not well understood by the West, the Israelis have emerged safer because of this this technology, and it's enabled the Palestinians to be safer as well. The more that the IDF has the time and space to make decisions without feeling the pressure of the public, an angry public, to exact retribution for the death and murder of their citizens, this has actually enabled the Israelis to say, okay, guys, we're going to hit a few more of your targets, and then we want a ceasefire. And, the wars have been shorter. They have been less bloody as a result. Now, unfortunately, I think as a result of Saturday's attack, I think that will not be the case in the next round of conflict. I think whatever is going to happen next in the Gaza Strip, I think that's when Mr. Zomlot will see what Israel has been capable of doing until now. The last thing that I'll just say is, there's a lot of talk about Hamas and Gaza and the open air prison. He said that about Gaza. The question of Gaza didn't need to go in the direction that it went in. But when Hamas took over that territory by force in a civil war, you got to remember, They won that territory in a bloody conflict, a civil war with their own. Once that happened, Israel sealed the border. It did not want anybody coming in and out of the Gaza Strip when it was run by a terrorist organization that had a track record of trying to destroy Israel. It's really not hard to understand. I mean, we sort of talk about the debate about the border in our country, and people are really unhappy about the fact that you have illegals streaming across and maybe eroding the American economy in some way, or just people not abiding by our laws. Imagine if Mexico was in fact a terrorist state where people were openly threatening American citizens and lobbing rockets at Texas. It would be an entirely different situation. And look, it's been an impossible situation for Israel and the Palestinians, and you have to feel for both sides of this. I mean, I'd love nothing more than to see this conflict end, but I think that this ambassador from the PLO, he's now the ambassador to the UK, I think he really did a disservice to his own people. If anybody had ever thought about supporting the Palestinian nationalist project, I would say that an interview like that would probably turn a lot of people off.
Returning to Hamas quickly, and I know we need to wrap up here soon, Jonathan. What is Hamas's ultimate goal, and why would they choose now for an attack?
The ultimate goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. That's the charter. They see themselves as part of a broader Islamist movement, but that's less important than the liberation of Palestine, as they call it. It's a fairly simple and blunt ideology that they represent. Why now is, I think, really the question that's been itching the back of my brain. Because when you launch a war against a state like Israel, and a war or an attack, let's say, that was as bloody and brutal as what we just witnessed, they know they are inviting a destructive war on their door. I mean, they know what's coming. They know that the Israelis can't just sit there and stomach this, that there will be, swift and harsh retribution. So the question is, why? I mean, do they do this because they just simply wanted to, end their time in Gaza? Do they want to invite a full-blown war that they know that they would lose? That's one way of reading it. The other one might be that they were launching the first phase of what could be a multi-phase war. And this is actually what I am watching and what I'm concerned about. We could see that Lebanon goes hot, so to speak. We could see that front erupt. Syria has assets belonging to Iran, Shiite militias that may be willing to do Iran's bidding. There are a number of terrorist groups that are active in the West Bank, where there are another 2.5 million Palestinians as well. And then Iran itself has, long-range rockets and missiles and all manner of weaponry that can be deployed against Israel. So there is a question of whether it's a multi-front war. And that, of course, is very scary to think about. A regional war alongside, by the way, a war that's already taking place in Ukraine, another one between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You get the picture here. The world might look very scary, and it might look scary very soon. We're obviously hoping that this is, for lots of reasons, that this current war is going to be contained in the Gaza Strip, that Israel is able to work quickly, and that the people of Gaza find a safe haven somewhere, and that perhaps the Middle East can move on after this with some lessons learned. That's the hope. The real fear is that this could turn into something wider, and I suspect we'll learn whether another front opens within the next couple of days.
There's been concern raised by the president of the United States, just an alert of that there's extra security assets in major American cities around Jewish community centers. There's been something that's circulating online. I actually don't want to give it too much attention, not knowing if I can verify it, Jonathan, about a Hamas member talking about a certain day of the week, this Friday being a day where calling additional fighters into the fight. And that is scary. Just like you mentioned the scenario just now of it's a scary thing to talk about a broader war. How many, based on your research, how much presence does Hamas have in the United States? Hezbollah as well, which is a terrorist organization that operates out of Lebanon. How much presence do they have here in the United States? How concerned are you that potential growth of this conflict actually comes to U.S. soil?
Look, it's a good question. At various points in recent history, we've seen the presence of Hamas charities, Hezbollah, sort of illicit finance networks operating in the country. I have not seen any indication of fighters that could be activated. I have seen in my previous life indications of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. These are sort of the special forces of the regime in Tehran, that they do have some assets, or at least historically they have. And we've seen actually the Iranians try to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington in the past. They tried to target the Israeli ambassador. These are things that are still quite feasible, and I would watch for Iran, especially if there is a wider war and Iran is involved and the U.S. responds in some way, and that is, of course, all possible. The Israelis, by the way, I should note, don't want the U.S. to intervene. They always say they want to defend themselves by themselves. They're very adamant about that. But I think the U.S. has an interest in trying to maintain a world order that it has constructed, and Iran stoking a regional war would, I think, fly in the face of that. And so there are going to be some interesting choices ahead for all of these actors. But certainly if the U.S. responds to Iran, it's not inconceivable to think about the activation of cells here. I think Iran would be really not wise. But then again, we've seen just in recent months attempts to attack former Trump administration officials here in the United States. We've seen attempts to kidnap Iranian dissidents that have been activists here in the United States. So, I mean, they're not afraid of operating here. And that is something that obviously the FBI must be very concerned about.
I have about a billion more questions for you, but I know we have to run. Some of those questions involve what is China thinking during all of this, especially when the world's not paying attention there? What about North Korea? What about Russia and Ukraine and all the places we're not paying attention to? But I will leave that for...
I'll
you will? Okay, good.
Look,
see, I tempted you a little bit there, Jonathan. I said, maybe I could get him in there.
We have, I think, too many hours together, on air that I can't leave one of your questions on the table.
Okay.
Look, every one of these actors, every one of these actors loves the distraction, right? The Russians have actually said so openly that they like it. Not that they, I don't know if they care whether Israel's attacked or not attacked, but they like it that the world is looking elsewhere and not squarely focused on Ukraine. And I would imagine that the Chinese are seeing this and saying, okay, well, if there's another war going on, maybe we have an opportunity to invade Taiwan. Or the North Koreans are saying, okay, well, maybe we can lob missiles at Korea and South Korea, and look, nobody does anything. So I think, they're watching and trying to learn from the American playbook right now. I don't know what they've learned yet, because the U.S. all it's done is really warned Iran and Hezbollah not to get involved. And we've sent some weapons to replenish the Israelis. And there could be some other assistance coming. I think that's all great. But there will be some real questions about American deterrence as this thing drags on, especially if Iran and Hezbollah are attempting to join the fray.
Okay, just returning to Gaza real quickly, because we have heard about this safe passage, and this came up at the White House press conference today about whether or not the White House or America would get involved in trying to get the people that are not Hamas safe passage out of Gaza as this fight continues. Why wouldn't Egypt accept families coming from Gaza that want safe passage out of Gaza? Why is there nowhere they may? So what about, because there are people, Jonathan, right? We should recognize in Gaza, young children that they just happen to be born in Gaza. Like my kids just happen to be born in the United States, and they want to leave. Right. So what about,
I think,
so what's the possibility?
I think Egypt is a country going through a really terrible economic downturn. It probably does not want 1 million or 2 million refugees on its soil. Doesn't have the resources. It doesn't have the ability. But I think it may have no choice. I mean, Gaza is, right? I mean, other than Israel and the Mediterranean Sea, Egypt is the only outlet. Israel's certainly not going to let anybody in. There's nowhere else to go. So I think the big question is, what does Egypt do once they travel through the Sinai? I think that really the answer should be that the Arab world should come together and hold responsible the actors that have sponsored Hamas over the years and brought this upon these refugees that we're expecting to see. I'm talking about Qatar, which is endless money. And by the way, also has a bunch of hotel rooms that are now sitting empty after the World Cup. Just putting that out there, right? The Qataris are a major sponsor of Hamas. I would love to see nothing more than to have the Qataris host 1 million people in their country. If they love the Palestinians so much, host them. The Turks have been sponsors of Hamas for a decade now. It's a modern country. Let them take in another. I mean, I know they've taken in Syrian refugees. Let them take in Palestinian ones too. Iran should take these refugees in. Look at what Iran has done around the region. There's another country. There's a couple of others that have been cheerleaders for Hamas over the years, Kuwait and Algeria. They've been agitating and pushing Hamas to engage in violence against Israel. Let them do it. I think that there should be a whole coalition of countries around the Arab world that take in these Palestinians who are, in fact, innocent, have done nothing wrong. Their only challenge right now is that they are living under Hamas rule, which many of these people didn't ask for in the first place. So I hope the U.S. is able to organize and galvanize and push these countries to start to do the right thing. It shouldn't only be Egypt. Egypt, because of proximity, because of geography, will have to be probably the first stop. But Egypt should not be expected to absorb all of this. So I hope the U.S. handles this the right way.
That was really helpful, though. You pointed out that there's options. Sometimes you get Egypt or you get Israel or you get the United States, and these are the people that can help. And well, that gives us. I didn't know about all those hotel rooms. 30 seconds, Jonathan. When you get up in the morning and you open up your phone and you're looking for that one piece of news or that one new piece of information, what are you looking for next in this story that we should all be aware of?
I'm looking for the potential evidence of a cyber attack that ultimately put Israel on its back foot. A lot of rumors are swirling about this right now, and I think we may yet see that substantiated. But really, the big thing I'm watching is Hezbollah. I wake up every morning right now wondering whether that northern front has gone hot because, as complicated as this has all been and as challenging as it is, it's one front. If it becomes two, it's a very different war. And it becomes something that starts to feel a bit more global. And that's what gives me. I mean, I already have probably too much gray hair, but it gives me a few more.
Well, I think we're all along there with you. And as you mentioned, we're mature now, Jonathan. We've experienced different things that we could talk about in the news cycle. Okay, I'll really let you go. You set up our next interview. Great for Hezbollah, though, so I appreciate that. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Anytime. Talk soon.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.